I'm Jason Lewis.
And I'm Todd DeShida.
And I'm Thomas Mills.
Welcome to Climate Optimists. As a couple concerned citizens, we're on a journey to explore climate solutions and ways each of us can make a difference. So I wanted to start out this week by saying a big thanks to all our listeners. This month, we're marking our 1-year anniversary as a podcast, as well as our 50th episode. And to celebrate the occasion, Thomas has offered to do a remote home energy audit for a lucky listener. So we're going to have a drawing, and to enter the contest, all you need to do is to send us a note through our website or send us a direct message through social media. Just in the subject line, put Climate Optimism, your name, and your email address, and we'll do the drawing on Friday, September 9th.
Thomas just got voluntold.
Happy to help, Todd. Happy to help.
Well, it has been a hell of a long time coming, but as most of you know, the U.S. has finally passed some real climate legislation. With this historic progress, we decided it was important to step back and spend an episode focused on, how it's going to achieve the emission reductions it says it is, how it's going to impact consumers, what, got added to keep Senator and aspiring coal baron Joe Manchin happy, and what work still remains. It blows me away because I was looking earlier this week and actually came across some environmental organizations that had taken an opposition position on the bill. And I get that the bill's not perfect, but it just blew me away that there were folks that were sort of saying we can't support this when is literally like our last chance to get meaningful legislation passed. How about you guys? How do you feel about the U.S. finally doing something on climate?
Well, I was surprised that it happened. I didn't hold out much hope that anything was going to get done, so I thought it was pretty amazing. And I know that everybody didn't get what they wanted, of course, but it's hard to let the perfect be the enemy of the good in this case. So I'm pretty stoked.
Yeah, no, I think it also encourages all other countries to sort of get on the bus now and start moving in that right direction. And once we all start heading there, we'll realize that it's not so difficult after all, and hopefully a lot of these targets will get increased and we'll go even harder and faster to achieving the goals.
That's a hope. I like that optimism, Thomas. Well, and speaking of optimism, for this week's Reason for Hope, we've got a source of optimism down under. You want to take us through what's happening?
Yeah, we've sort of been running a bit of a similar path to you, where we've been arguing about climate change for the last 30 years or so in Australia, but finally those climate wars have come to an end, and the House of Representatives here have passed a bill to reduce our carbon emissions in Australia by 43% on 2005 levels by 2030. There are also provisions for 2050. But it is important to keep in mind that this is a framework. So it's more around the reporting and the responsibility of government organisations to set mechanisms that enable us to achieve these set targets, and less so heavy on the detail that there evidently is in your climate bill. So those specifics will come later, but it's now, it will be, once this is passed the Senate, which is pretty much a sure thing, a legal framework that will force the country to move in the right direction regarding CO2 emissions. Is it enough? No, not yet, but that's the beauty of the way this has been structured. The 43% is a flaw, and the Greens worked hard to get mechanisms in this bill that allow us to ratchet that up as we move towards those climate targets.
Yeah, that's good to hear. I mean, especially that there's a mechanism to make things more aggressive down the road because, like this progress in the US, it's good, but it's not quite there yet. So we're going to need to do more. But yeah, exciting. We got two big countries making steps in the right direction.
So speaking of the Inflation Reduction Act, jumping right in here, how much do we expect the bill to cut emissions, which is the important thing, right?
Yeah, so all of this is kind of done via modeling, and there's a number of analyses that have been performed. The two models that I spent time looking at were from the Rhodium Group and an organization called Energy Innovation. And to simplify things, because their analyses have like high and low, and middle scenarios, we're just going to focus on middle of the road. And basically, if you take Energy Innovation's middle of the road scenario, they're forecasting that it could be a 39% reduction, so nearly 40% in emissions by 2030. And if you take the Rhodium Group assessment, it's almost the same thing, 40% by 2030. And obviously there were things already in play. There are already states and certain federal actions that were in place, but this brings us another 10 to 15% cut in emissions, in total emissions by 2030, which is massive. And it's like the Australian bill, that's not enough to get us where we need to be. We've pledged to the international community a 50 to 52% cut by 2030, but it's a big step in the right direction. Just as an aside, I don't know why all these countries are cutting it so close. I mean, it's like we know we need to make at least a 50% cut, and it's just ironic to me that everybody's sort of inching their way up, and it's like just barely getting to 50% instead of trying to aim for something like 60 or more.
Yeah. So how is it going to do it? What are the pieces or the sectors that will have the cuts?
Yeah, so it's really about the power sector. The vast majority of the cuts come to our electricity sector. And as some folks may be aware, the power sector is the second biggest source of emissions behind transportation here in the US. They're both roughly about, a quarter of our emissions, give or take. And so it's getting those reductions in the power sector. It's all about tax credits. So extension of existing tax credits for renewables, additional credits for things like energy storage, extension of tax credits for nuclear that keep, existing nuclear plants online longer.
Hmm.
And it's got some other perks that aren't necessarily emissions focused. Like it has what's called an energy community bonus, where developers would qualify for additional tax credits if the facilities are located in areas that are next to current or past fossil fuel infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
There's an environmental justice bonus. So if you're, locating your facilities next to low-income communities, there's additional tax benefit there. So yeah, roughly 3/4 is from the power sector. And then there are, additional chunks, about 10% coming from carbon removal, funding of direct air capture and incentives for carbon storage in forests and agriculture. You've got about 10% of the impact coming from carbon capture facilities in industry. So that's, putting carbon capture on, let's say, a cement manufacturing plant or a steel plant. And then the final area where we have some, reductions are in the transport side with the electric vehicle credits, existing and then new credits for used vehicles. And that, when we're talking about the impact of this bill, about 3% of the impact is in the transportation side. So kind of, again, 3/4 of it is the power sector, roughly 10 or so in, carbon removal, industry about 10, and then around 3% coming from transportation.
So is the 3% number, which seems kind of small, is it because what's in the bill isn't really doing that much to impact the transportation sector overall, or is it because we're already, kind of headed in that direction and doing so well with like people buying EVs that this bill just isn't going to do that much more to kind of impact that? Is that known?
Yeah, that was a head scratcher for me too, because I expected when we looked at the analysis that there would be a big chunk of the emission reductions would come in transportation. But I think the reality of the smaller impact is sort of twofold, or maybe threefold. One, this has some mineral and battery sourcing requirements
Hmm.
that in the near term will actually slow down the uptake, because you're going to have, let's say, you're going to have the big car companies having to shift to ensure that they have, meet these domestic sourcing requirements.
Right.
The other thing is cars have a long operating life. And so, vehicles may be out there 10, 15 years. So even though these are some good incentives, it takes a while for them to really, make the dent. And then I think the third thing is the one that you pointed out, which is we're already on that trajectory. And so this is helping accelerate it a little bit, but we're already headed in that direction because of the, big drops in the cost of electric vehicles and, the uptick in adoption.
Right.
I think another thing to point out there too is that, a lot of this is modeled, right? And we know that all these adoption curves follow S curves, and we're just at the moment where we're seeing at least 50% per annum growth. I mean, some years Tesla's growing at more than 80% per annum. So I think we're going to surprise ourselves with how rapidly that uptake occurs over the next few years. And I'd be very surprised if by 2030, you might have to quote me on this, but we're not seeing a sort of 80% plus sales rate of electric versus internal combustion vehicles.
Hey, I'd be stoked if that's what we hit,
Yeah. Heck yeah.
And I think you're right. I mean, generally speaking, these modeling, it's not to say necessarily they're being conservative, but there are certain kind of concrete things that they're having to put into their tool. And, yeah, I mean, if you look everywhere, you can see that things are beating forecasts in terms of EV adoption. So we're talking here about electric vehicle credits. And I think, there may be a lot of folks wondering, well, how is this bill going to impact, consumers? And Todd, I know you did some research on kind of the different elements of this that could impact a, typical American.
Yeah, well, there's definitely a lot here. One of the first things is air quality, and it could cut, air pollutants from the power sector up to 82%, which is, pretty staggering.
Yeah.
And which could avoid, close to 4,000 premature deaths, 100K asthma attacks annually by 2030. So just huge. When we talk about EV tax credits, there's still a $7,500 credit, but they did eliminate the manufacturer quota. So some of you might remember that there was a cap on how many vehicles. I can't remember if it was 250,000 vehicles or something like that. If you manufactured, once you got to that cap, any vehicles after that no longer, could apply for the credit. So Tesla and GM vehicles will now be eligible again, which is huge. But there are some limits on that. So based on your income, any individual making over 150K won't be able to apply, and a family would be 300K. So, but that's pretty high, right? So there's going to be a lot of folks that are going to be able to apply for that credit. And there's also some limits on the total cost of the vehicles themselves. So for a car, it's 55K, which, I suppose you get some of these Teslas with a couple options or something, you're probably getting near that 55K, which, it sounds outrageous to spend 55K on a car to me, but, that's what they cost these days, I guess. But one of the things I thought was kind of a bummer, and Thomas mentioned this, that they didn't include, electric bikes in this bill, which is kind of a bummer. And then they have the cap for SUVs and trucks up to like 80K, which kind of, you could say kind of moves backward to what we're trying to do. It seems like they're kind of incentivizing you to buy large vehicles, which, are more inefficient. And it just seems like that might be moving in the wrong direction. It seems like we want to incentivize people to go smaller, as small as you can, right? And get more bang for your buck out of energy and efficiency. So I thought that was kind of a bummer. Used cars, you can get 4K or 30% of the vehicle cost, but that's cars for selling less than 25K. And I think they have to be over 2 years old as well. So just some things to think about if you're looking to buy used, but still $4,000 is a good chunk.
Yeah.
I know you talked about some of the stipulations on the manufacturing and the, sourcing the materials for the batteries. And that's something else I think we should talk about here. The Alliance for Automotive Innovation, which represents about 98% of cars and light trucks sold in the U.S., their estimate is that 70% of electric vehicles currently sold would not be eligible for the tax credits upon passage of the bill. Now, I don't know if that number's high, but I could definitely tell that GM and Ford and Tesla weren't as concerned about these stipulations, but some of the foreign automakers obviously were fairly upset, right? It's also that stipulation came from none other than our old pal, Joe Black Coal Rolling Manchin, and he's the one that really put this in the bill. And he basically said, I don't believe we should be building transportation on the backs of foreign supply chains, and I'm not going to do it. And so, but I think I've realized what Joe's deal is. And I think the guy has like a digging fetish, right? Because I think they were like, how are we going to get Joe to sign off on this bill? And they were like, Joe, we'll have mines. And he said, mines? I'm behind it. I think this guy like clasps a coal shovel at night when he goes to bed. He's just like mumbling to himself about digging somewhere. I think he has a digging fetish. I think that's how they got him.
Yeah, I was sad to see, and we'll get to it, some of the stipulations that made it in, but this is all about compromise, and obviously, getting rid of the cap on vehicles and having a used car credit, those are big benefits.
And I'm not saying that buying American isn't good, right? Like, I mean, I think that's what he was trying to push for, right? Was having this stuff made in America, buying American, and that's all good. But to me, it seems like it's good for. It really is kind of good for Tesla, Ford, and GM, and probably bad for just about everybody else.
Yeah, I think the other part of that, though, too, is, I mean, global supply chain stability. The fact that so much of the anode and cathode material, especially, is coming out of, well, call a spade a spade. It's coming out of China, right? And the US is very concerned about that. We had a recent bit of a trade war with China, and they just turn around and they'll shut down all imports or exports of one product or another, and that could make the US manufacturing situation extremely difficult if they gear up for production locally of electric vehicles without having the supply chain to back it for the battery manufacturing. So I think in the short term, sure, it's going to create a few problems, and especially for these foreign automakers who are going to have to sort of drop out of the race. But I think in the long term, it will create a more stable manufacturing sector in the US for the supply of batteries and electric vehicles.
Yeah. Well, the fact is they can still sell cars. They're just not going to be able to, get the credit, which isn't going to make them as a competitive, but maybe they'll find other ways, to be competitive. I don't know.
And on the minerals side of it, I think there are allowances for mining of those minerals in, I guess, a more acceptable range of countries. Australia was one of the countries included on that list, but as you can probably imagine, China wasn't.
Sure.
Yeah. So it sounds like good news on the electric vehicle side of things. Bummer we didn't get bikes in there. Definitely a future improvement that needs to be made. I know there was also some, clean energy credits that got extended for like the residential side, and then some energy efficiency stuff as well.
Yeah, there were some energy credits and rebates in these cases. They're now extended through 2034. It applies to wind, solar, geothermal, biomass, and energy storage now as well. And there'll be start out with the possibility of a 30% credit, which will eventually decline to 22% by 2034. And on the rebate grant side, they could help you cover the cost of an installation of equipment, and it was going to increase the value of the existing tax credits and create new programs for homeowners to cover things like insulation, efficient doors, windows, heat pumps. And obviously, it was incentivized the lower your income was. I did some of the rebate, especially on like the 8K on the heat pump. I think if you were the rebates weren't available if you're earning above 150% of your area median income, and I don't know how they determine what your area is, but I did it for Clackamas County, which is where I live, which is 82K a year. So if you make over 123K, you wouldn't be eligible for the rebate. I don't know if that's how they get the numbers, but my only concern with that was like, well, it kind of seems like if you make enough money to own a home, you might be, because like it takes a lot of money to own a home around here. So,
Right.
It could potentially exclude a lot of people from those rebates. But I assume they figure if you're making above a certain amount, you should just be able to afford to put in a heat pump. Probably, I guess is the idea behind that. But I mean, it's definitely good that they're incentivizing it for lower income folks. I think that's good.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in some ways it's like you want to, if folks can afford it, you don't want to subsidize that, but I think there's also
Sure.
this, it's all about incentivizing the right behavior. And so in some ways it's like making it really cheap to, make your home energy efficient is a good thing, whether it's for somebody with low income or high income, right? Because we know we want all homes to be energy efficient, and the folks who are making more money are living in the bigger houses that consume more energy. But
Right.
yeah, I thought it was exciting though, you're talking about the combination of tax credits and rebates for energy efficiency, and then that in addition to that, the clean energy credit, for that applies to wind, solar, et cetera, that got extended as well. So you've kind of got both the ability to be subsidized for putting energy generation equipment on your house, right? Solar panels. And then you're also getting incentivized to make your home more efficient, so it requires less energy. So it's really both sides of the equation, which I thought was good. Thomas, I don't know how it is or how this reality now compares to like Australia, but it's nice to see the U.S. really putting some emphasis in dollars on the residential side of things, both on energy efficiency and clean energy, because the reality is homes are a huge part of our carbon footprint.
Yeah, I think having that 30% tax credit for the solar side of things and the battery storage is huge. That's what's driven Australia to be the number one residential solar installer in the world. So that mechanism tied also to the batteries is going to be a great step in the right direction, because you will get to the situations that we're facing in Australia where your residential solar penetration will be so high that you end up having to curtail that generation, which is really disappointing, because you shouldn't have to do that, because we need as much as we can, but it's about having that available at the right time of day. And that's typically in the morning and evenings in these residential situations. So the storage side of it, great, fantastic that you've taken that step, because we haven't here yet. In fact, our residential solar mechanism that currently exists, our STC program, is getting ramped down every year till it expires by 2030. However, with the recent lower house passing of this new climate bill in Australia, hopefully those incentives get reinstated in Australia.
So, I think as a listener, we've probably thrown a lot of like numbers and, stats your way. And the reality is it's going to take a while to digest this. I think the good news is this works its way, through into implementation. It will be much cleaner and simpler. But we will have links to a couple good articles on our website if you want to kind of dig into, the potential credits that are going to be available on the efficiency side, the electrical vehicle side, or clean energy side for your home. So I think as we rightfully celebrate the good news with this climate bill, it does beg the question: what are the paths to get us to where we need to be, that 50% cut by 2030? And reading through some of the analyses, it's clear that there's more to be done in the building sector, the industrial sector, things like cement and steel manufacturing, and we need to be able to accelerate that electrification of our transportation sector as well. And in my humble opinion, I think, while I don't know how politically palatable it is at this point, that what we really need is a carbon tax. We've talked about a fee and dividend mechanism on this podcast before, but when we're talking about things like passenger vehicles, if it's still cheap to continue to put gasoline in your car and drive it, there's going to be less of an incentive for people to move more quickly to electric vehicles. So yeah, there are other sectors that need attention aside from the power sector, and I think in my mind the cleanest way to potentially do that is through something that puts a price on carbon, because at the end of the day, that's really what we want to eliminate. And as long as it's free to put carbon up in the air, yeah, it's going to be hard to squeeze out those remaining emission reductions. I don't know, Thomas. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the building sector, I think, can still have a big role to play in these reductions, and there's a lot of opportunity left there. And I am of the opinion that that needs to be driven by changes in the building codes. I haven't found a lot of detail in there yet. There is some talk of rebates around insulation, but it's about how do we go forward building houses for the climate that is going to be here in 40 years' time. So I really think that we need to be really ratcheting up the requirements around new building structures and offering incentives and rebates for those to retrofit existing structures so that their energy use is reduced regardless of what the source of heating or cooling is for the building itself.
Yeah, and that's a good point in the building sector too. I mean, I think, tends to be more focus, or often more focus on new buildings, whether those are residential or commercial. And the reality is the vast majority of our buildings are existing buildings. So we need to be able to move those from, in some cases, buildings that are very inefficient to ones that are extremely efficient. And to your point, are set up for a climate that we're going to have down the road, not the one that we have today.
So back to Joe Roland Cole Manchin. How much did he really impact this bill, and what problems did he cause?
So there were some, stipulations around, permitting for, things like pipelines. The biggest sort of concession was making more offshore and onshore leases available, fossil fuel leases on federal land. And, at face value, that's obviously not a good thing. We don't want to be putting in any additional fossil fuel infrastructure. But in looking at the analyses that have been done, the good news is, by and large, the impact of having more land available to lease for, extraction of fossil fuels is small. And, Energy Innovation in their analysis estimates that for every ton of additional emissions that come from these leases, there's 25 tons in emission reductions. So, I know, there's a lot of folks that are kind of focused in on, how this enables additional fossil fuel infrastructure. And again, it's definitely not a good thing, but when you look at the numbers, the impact is going to be relatively small. So, from my perspective, he extracted some concessions, and it's, if that, is what it took to get his vote, to get all these good things across the finish line, then it was, worth the sacrifice.
All right. Thanks, Joe.
And so I guess that leads to our, the question we always ask, which is, what can we do? And Thomas, I know you've got some ideas given the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah, I think we can do a lot at a personal level, like to basically develop a plan for how can we make the most of these opportunities that are going to be arising as a result of this act. How do we plan on utilizing some of these incentives to better insulate our house, get rid of that gas water heater and replace it with a carbon dioxide heat pump? Right? How do we encourage our next door neighbor who is about to buy some fancy Mercedes to go and buy an electric Tesla instead? So I think it's one of those things where there are things that we could be delaying, or there are things that we can do as soon as this bill is enacted that will allow us to make these carbon dioxide emission savings immediately. Because the sooner we can do it, the less emissions that go up in the air, the more likely we are to achieve the 1.5 degree targets.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And again, we'll have links on our website to articles that help kind of break down the menu of incentives that this bill produces. But yeah, Thomas, I agree. I mean, everybody should take the time to get familiar with kind of what's out there, and then look at your upcoming purchases and try to leverage what's in this bill to have the benefits be realized sooner. Well, that's it for this week's episode. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. Come back next week when we'll be digging into the topic of trees and their power to help us achieve climate targets. Climate Optimists is made possible by Climate Stewards Collective. You can find us on the web at climateoptimist.co. And don't forget to follow us on social at Climate Optimist Podcast.